can you believe it? He got fired for helping a hero. Dan Harris was the kind of guy who didn't think twice about pulling over when someone needed help. That day, it was a veteran stranded on the side of a rainy highway. A small act of kindness, but it ended up costing him the job and route he'd faithfully driven for 2 decades. But the story didn't end there. That very night, something happened that would completely turn his world around. Hi everyone, and welcome to Life Tales. Let's dive into this one. Dan Harris, 58, had spent more than 20 years behind the wheel on the same familiar route. While other drivers often jumped from company to company chasing higher paychecks, Dan stayed with Reed Shipping. What kept him there wasn't the money, it was the people he met along the way. He'd built relationships with diner owners, gas station clerks, and countless regulars at his stops. They weren't just faces to him, they were part of his extended road family. His values came from his father, a man who had not only driven trucks but also served in Vietnam. Growing up, Dan often heard his dad's favorite saying, "A trucker never drives past someone who needs help. Today's stranger could be tomorrow's savior." Even 10 years after his father passed away, those words still guided Dan's every decision. Other drivers affectionately called him old school. He still used paper maps right alongside his GPS, and he actually talked to people at his stops instead of just scrolling through his phone. In the cab of his truck, he kept a weathered leather photo album, each page telling a different story. There were photos of families he'd helped when they broke down, truckers he'd pulled out of snowbanks, and veterans he'd given lifts to. On the back of each picture, in Dan's careful handwriting, was a short note about what had happened. Back when Joseph Reed Sr. was in charge, Reed Shipping had felt like a family. The company had been built on trust, loyalty, and a strong sense of community. But everything changed when his son, Joseph Jr., took over the business the year before. The new leadership prioritized efficiency, numbers, and GPS tracking over people and values. One chilly October morning, Dan was making his usual rounds when a heavy downpour began hammering his windshield. The weather service had issued storm warnings and many drivers were already falling behind. Dan himself had received 3 reminders from dispatch about staying on schedule. As he rounded a bend, he spotted a vehicle with its hood up parked on the shoulder. Despite the sheets of rain, he noticed someone in military uniform waving at the passing cars, hoping someone would stop. One truck after another sped by, most drivers likely too worried about being late. But Dan didn't think twice. He eased onto the shoulder and pulled over. Climbing down from his cab, he saw the man was elderly, likely in his mid-60s, and wore a Vietnam veteran cap that looked just like the one his dad used to wear. The man introduced himself as Harold Lawson. He explained that he was trying to get to Fort Leonard Wood for his granddaughter's basic training graduation. His car had finally given out, leaving him stranded miles from help. As Dan approached, Harold was standing in the rain, phone in hand, trying, and failing to get a signal. "Need a hand, sir?" Dan asked, already heading toward his toolbox. "I hate to trouble you," Harold replied, "but I can't afford to miss this. My granddaughter, Megan, is graduating. She's the first woman in our family to join the service, just like her granddad." Dan glanced at his watch. Between the weather and the stop, he was now running 40 minutes behind. His phone buzzed again. Another ping from dispatch pushing him to get back on track. But when he looked at Harold, soaking wet and anxious, he thought of his father and knew exactly what he had to do. "Let's take a look at your car first," Dan said, silencing his phone without even glancing at the screen. They spent the next half hour soaked to the bone, working under the hood of Harold's old Chevy. Dan ran through every fix he could think of, but it was no use. The engine needed parts they didn't have. His phone had buzzed 6 more times by then, but he ignored each alert. This, he knew, was more important than making a delivery window. "Sir," Dan finally said, wiping the rain from his face, "this car's not getting back on the road today. But I'm headed in the general direction of Fort Leonard Wood. It's a bit of a detour, but I can get you there." Harold hesitated. "That's got to be, 3 hours off your route? You'll lose your whole day." "Some things matter more than staying on schedule," Dan replied with quiet conviction. "Nobody's missing their granddaughter's graduation. Not on my watch." During the long drive, the 2 men talked. Harold shared stories about Megan, how she grew up on tales of his military service, and how proud he was to see her carry on the family legacy. He even showed Dan a photo of her in uniform, beaming with pride. Dan, in turn, talked about his own upbringing, what it was like growing up in a trucking family, and how the roads used to feel different. Back then, truckers always had each other's backs. Meanwhile, Dan's phone continued to buzz, each message from dispatch angrier than the last. They arrived at Fort Leonard Wood just in time. As Harold climbed out of the truck, he reached for his wallet, insisting on giving Dan something for gas. Dan just shook his head. "Just do me one favor," he said with a smile. "Take a picture with your granddaughter. That'll be enough for me." Dan watched Harold disappear into the crowd outside the graduation hall, then turned back to his truck. That's when he saw it, 15 missed calls, all from Joseph Reed Jr. His heart dropped. He took a deep breath and tapped the call back button. "Where the hell are you?" Reed Jr. barked the moment he picked up. "You're 3 hours late. The GPS says you went completely off route." "Sir," Dan began, trying to stay calm, "I stopped to help a veteran. He was stuck in the range." "I don't care if it was the president himself," Reed Jr. snapped. "You cost us money today. This isn't a charity, Harris. You're fired. Clean out your truck. The new driver will pick it up tomorrow." Dan stood silently in the rain, phone still in hand, as he watched families laughing and embracing in the distance. 2 decades of unwavering dedication, hundreds of deliveries made right on time, all wiped away in a moment because he chose to do the right thing. The drive back home that evening felt heavier than any haul he'd ever made. With every familiar stop he passed, Dan had to share the same painful truth with people he'd known for years. He wouldn't be coming around anymore. At Gus's truck stop, a place he'd pulled into every week for the past 15 years, Gus himself stepped out from behind the counter to hear what had happened. "They canned you for helping a vet?" Gus asked, shaking his head. "That just ain't right, Dan. Not right at all." By the time Dan pulled into the driveway of his modest home, his phone was buzzing once more, but this time it wasn't dispatch. Word was getting out fast. Gus had jumped on the CB radio, and Dan's story was now bouncing between truckers up and down highways across 3 states. What Joseph Reed Jr. didn't realize was that Harold Lawson wasn't just another veteran. After his time in the service, Harold helped found the Veterans Trucking Association, a group of former soldiers who'd become truckers, united by their mission to help other veterans find careers on the road. For 30 years, they'd been quietly building a network, giving vets a new path forward. The moment the graduation ceremony ended, Harold picked up his phone. First, he called his old friends in the trucking world. Then he reached out to the local press. And just like that, the story of Dan's firing began to spread like wildfire, echoing through truck stops, CB chatter, and social media feeds. Soon, the name Dan Harris came to stand for something bigger. He became a symbol of old-school values, doing what's right, keeping your word, and always helping those in need. That night, while Dan sat at his kitchen table staring at unpaid bills and wondering how he'd cover the mortgage, he heard something strange. First, the low hum of a single diesel engine. Then another. And another. The vibrations shook the table until his coffee rippled in the cup. Stepping outside, he froze at the sight before him. The road in front of his house was lined with trucks. Dozens at first, then hundreds stretching out into the night, headlights glowing like stars. It brought a lump to Dan's throat. At the front of the convoy stood none other than Old Man Reed himself, Joseph Sr., who had come out of retirement after hearing what his son had done. Behind him were drivers from across the region, including veterans who had driven through the night to show their support. "Dan," Reed Sr. said as he walked up the driveway, "my son lost sight of what this business was built on. It was never just about moving freight, it's always been about people. And every one of these drivers has a story about how you helped them when it counted." Harold stood beside him, Megan proudly wearing her new service uniform. Together, they handed Dan a custom Veterans Trucking Association jacket. "You've always been one of us, Dan," Harold said with a smile. "Now it's official." Then Old Man Reed held out a set of keys. "I'm starting a new company," he explained. "It's going to be different, focused on helping those who need it most. Training, support, respect. And I want you at the helm." He nodded toward the long line of waiting trucks. "These men and women, they're ready to join. We'll offer fair pay, proper benefits. You won't have to worry about money again. You and your family deserve that peace." Today, Dan is the head of Old Guard Transportation, now the largest veteran-owned trucking company in the Midwest. They've built a unique program to help veterans transition into trucking, and every driver they hire is trained to stop when someone's in need. That old photo album Dan used to keep in his cab? It now covers an entire wall in the company's headquarters, each framed memory a testament to the people he's helped, with more added every month. Meanwhile, Reed Jr.'s company never recovered. Most of his best drivers left the night Dan was fired. 6 months later, he sold off the business and moved to the city quietly and with little fanfare. In Dan's office, among all the keepsakes and thank you notes, there's a special photo of Harold and Megan from her graduation. Next to it hangs his father's old Vietnam veteran cap. Just beneath, a plaque reads the company's motto: Brotherhood of the Road. No one left behind. Dan still gets behind the wheel sometimes. He likes to bring new drivers along, teaching them the old ways. If you see someone stuck out there, he tells them, you stop. 'Cause most times, the right thing to do isn't the easiest. But if you stick to your values, you'll never be standing alone. The trucking industry may have evolved since Dan first hit the highway, but some things haven't changed. Somewhere out there, every single day, a truck pulls over to help. And odds are that driver learned it from Dan Harris or from someone he trained. Because sometimes losing everything is what leads you to something greater. And standing up for what's right? That's how we remind the world what truly matters. Enjoyed this story? Tap the like button and make sure to subscribe for more. And don't miss the next video, it's waiting for you right now. See you there.